7 years after being cast out by her own father for falling in love with the heir of a rival Mafia family, Valentina returns to New York with her young son, a child whose father, Salvatore, has never known existed. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Romance channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. The rain over Manhattan smelled like gunmetal and lilies. Valentina Moretti stood at the tall, arched window of the funeral home on Fifth Avenue, one gloved hand pressed flat against the cold glass, watching black town cars slide up to the curb like a procession of coffins themselves. 7 years. 7 years since she had seen this skyline through anything other than an airplane window. 7 years since she had let herself imagine standing this close to the city that had once tried to bury her alive. Behind her, in the hush of the viewing room, lay Don Enzo Conti, the aging patriarch, the man who had ruled 2 decades of blood and silence over the East Coast underworld. Dead now, at last, of nothing more dramatic than a failing heart. It was, Valentina thought bitterly, the least violent thing anyone in that family had ever done. "Mama?" A small hand tugged at her coat. "Is that him? The bad man they're all scared of?" She looked down at her son. Matteo was 6 years old, dark-haired, dark-eyed, with a stubborn set to his jaw that she had spent years pretending not to recognize, because recognizing it meant remembering the man who had given it to him. "He's not the man they're scared of anymore, tesoro," she murmured, crouching to straighten his small black tie. "He's just a man now. That's all any of them are, in the end." Matteo studied her with the unnerving seriousness only children possess. "Then why are your hands shaking?" Valentina didn't answer. She rose, smoothed her black dress, and looked once more into the room where the Conti family had gathered like crows around their fallen king. And that was when she saw him. Salvatore. 7 years had made him harder, not softer. The boy she remembered had had a wildness to him, an impatience simmering just beneath composed features, as if he were always one heartbeat away from breaking something. The man standing at the head of the room, accepting condolences with a single incline of his head, radiated something far more dangerous. Stillness. Absolute, terrifying stillness, the kind predators wore right before they moved. He wore black, like it had been tailored onto his grief. His jaw was shadowed, his dark hair cut close at the sides, his eyes, that impossible storm grey she used to fall asleep thinking about, scanning the room the way a man scans a battlefield, cataloguing threats. Then those eyes found her. The room did not stop. The murmured condolences did not pause. The priest did not falter in his Latin. But for Valentina, everything else simply ceased to exist. Salvatore Conti went rigid, one hand curling slowly into a fist at his side, as if the sight of her had physically struck him. 7 years. She had rehearsed this moment on the flight from Milan 100 times, had told herself she would be cold, composed, distant, a stranger arriving to pay respects to a man who had once, in his own brutal way, been kind to her. She had not rehearsed the way her heart would slam against her ribs like a fist against a locked door. "Mama, you're squeezing my hand," Matteo whispered. She released him at once, horrified, and pressed a kiss to the crown of his head. Go find Nonna Eleanor by the flowers, amore. I'll be right there. He hesitated, glancing once more toward the tall man across the room, who was still staring at his mother as though she were a ghost risen for the express purpose of unmaking him. And then, obedient as ever, Matteo scampered off toward the elderly woman arranging white lilies near the casket. Valentina forced her spine straight and crossed the room. It was, she would later think, the longest walk of her life. 20 feet of Persian carpet that felt like 20 miles, past the hooded stares of men who had once called her father friend and then enemy in the same breath, past Conti soldiers who did not bother hiding their surprise at a Moretti daughter darkening this doorway. But she had not come back to New York to hide. She had come back because her father was dying too, in his own way, of an old man's stubborn refusal to reconcile, and because certain debts, certain silences, could not be carried into another decade. She stopped in front of Salvatore. Up close, the years showed more plainly. A thin, white scar through one eyebrow that hadn't been there before. Faint lines bracketing a mouth that used to laugh so easily and rarely did any more. Salvatore, she said, and hated how his name still felt like a prayer in her mouth. Valentina. His voice had gone lower, rougher, scraped raw by 7 years of something she couldn't name. You came back. I came for the funeral. Your grandfather was... She faltered. He was kind to me once, before everything. Before everything, Salvatore repeated softly, and something moved behind his eyes, quick and violent as lightning, gone before she could read it. Is that what we're calling it now? She lifted her chin. What would you call it? He studied her for a long moment, close enough that she could see the muscle ticking in his jaw, close enough to smell the same cedar and clove cologne that had haunted 7 years of her memory. I'd call it The Night You Left Without a Single Word, Valentina. Not a note, not a call, nothing. After everything He stopped himself, visibly, the way a man stops a car inches from a cliff edge. His gaze flicked past her shoulder toward the small, dark-haired boy standing dutifully beside an elderly woman near the flowers, and something in his expression shifted, sharpened, though he could not possibly have understood what he was looking at. Not yet. "Is that your son?" Salvatore asked. Valentina's heart stopped. Yes. He has your eyes, Salvatore said, and there was something almost gentle in it, something that undid her more than his anger ever could. Where's his father? The question hung between them like a blade balanced on its point. That, Valentina said quietly, is a conversation for another day, not here. Not over your grandfather's casket. Salvatore's gaze lingered on her a moment longer, dark and unreadable, and then, because they both understood, in the wordless language 2 old lovers never fully lose, that this was a truce and not a surrender, he inclined his head. Another day, then, he said. But you're not disappearing again, Valentina. Not this time. She did not answer him. She simply turned, walked back across that endless carpet toward her son, and prayed to whatever god still listened to women like her, that Salvatore Conti would never learn just how much truth he had already stumbled toward, and how very little time remained before the whole rotten architecture of lies that had separated them came finally, catastrophically, undone. Outside, thunder rolled over the city like a warning no one alive was wise enough to heed. 7 years earlier. The first time Salvatore Conti saw Valentina Moretti, she was standing on the wrong side of a truce dinner, laughing at something her cousin had said, and he thought, with the clarity of a man watching his own house catch fire, I am going to ruin my entire life over this woman. He had been 26 then, already his father's favoured son, already fluent in the particular grammar of violence that ran their world, who owed whom, who could be trusted with a debt, and who could only be trusted with a bullet. He had grown up understanding that Morettis were not people, not really, not in the ledger his family kept. Morettis were a line item marked enemy, had been since before his father was born, over territory and blood, and a betrayal 3 generations deep that nobody alive could even properly explain anymore, only avenge. And then this girl, in a green dress, had looked up across a room full of men pretending to be civil, caught him staring, and smiled like she already knew every terrible thing he was thinking. "You're staring," she'd said later, cornering him by the terrace doors while their fathers argued inside about fishing rights that were never really about fish. "It's rude." "I'm assessing," Salvatore had answered. "Occupational habit." "Assessing what?" "Whether you're as dangerous as your father says you are." She had laughed then, a real laugh, unguarded, nothing like the practiced social laughter he'd heard from 100 women in 100 rooms just like this one. "I'm not dangerous at all, Mr. Conti. I'm the harmless one. My brother's the one you should worry about." "I don't worry about your brother." "No?" "No," Salvatore had said, stepping closer than propriety allowed, close enough to see her breath catch. "I worry about you." That had been the beginning. Not the dinner itself, not the fragile treaty their fathers had hammered out over cigars that neither family would honour for longer than a season, but that moment on the terrace, with the city glittering below them like something they might actually be allowed to have. What followed was 8 months that Salvatore would later divide his whole life around, the way calendars divide themselves around the birth of Christ, before Valentina, after Valentina. There was no version of himself that existed outside those 2 epochs. They met in places their family's spies were least likely to look, a jazz club in Brooklyn that neither Moretti nor Conti money had ever touched, a bookstore in the village that stayed open past midnight for the sole owner's insomnia, the back pew of a church where confession was the perfect cover story for 2 people confessing nothing at all except how much they wanted each other. Valentina taught him to slow dance badly and laugh at himself for it. Salvatore taught her to shoot, standing behind her at a range upstate, his hands over hers on the grip, murmuring corrections against her ear that had very little to do with marksmanship. "If our fathers knew," she'd said once, lying with her head on his chest, in a rented room above a restaurant that served the best osso buco in Little Italy. "They would kill us both." "They'd try," Salvatore had said, and meant it as something closer to a vow than a joke. He had loved her with the total, humourless intensity of a man who had never before allowed himself to want anything he could not simply take. It frightened him. He had told her so, once in the dark. "I don't know how to want something I can't control, Valentina, and I can't control you." And she had kissed the confession off his mouth like it was the truest thing he'd ever said to her. because it was. He had planned to marry her. He had gone so far as to have a ring made, not the Conti signet his mother expected him to give a bride, but something quieter, an emerald, the exact shade of the dress she'd worn the night they met, set simply, meant only for her. He never gave it to her. Because 3 weeks before he meant to, someone in his own house had shown him photographs. Valentina, laughing in a car with a man Salvatore didn't recognize, her hand on his arm with an intimacy that turned Salvatore's blood to acid. Valentina, at a hotel he knew, at an hour he knew, on a night she had told him she was visiting her aunt in Boston. A voice recording, badly cut, unmistakably her voice, saying words that gutted him where he stood. "I'm only doing this for the family. Salvatore doesn't need to know. Once we've used him for the information we need, I'll be done with him." He had not questioned it. That was the wound beneath the wound, the one he had never confessed to anyone, not even himself, in the privacy of 3 a.m. insomnia. He had not questioned it at all. He had simply believed, instantly and completely, that the girl who loved him had been performing that love for her father's benefit the entire time. Because some small, ancient, wounded part of him had never truly believed a Moretti could love a Conti without an angle, without a ledger entry attached. He had gone to her that same night, cold as December, and ended it in words so surgical he still heard himself saying them sometimes in dreams. "I know what you are now. I know what this was. Don't ever contact me again." She had not defended herself. That was what haunted him most. She had simply gone white and still and said very quietly, "If that's what you believe of me, then you never knew me at all," and walked out of his life as though she had been waiting for exactly this, as though some part of her had always known the fairy tale would end in exactly this kind of blood. 2 weeks later, she was gone from New York entirely. Milan, someone said. Then nothing. No calls, no word. 7 years of silence, so total it had felt some nights like she had simply never existed, like he had invented an entire woman out of loneliness and grief and called her love. And now she was standing across his grandfather's casket with a 6-year-old son whose eyes were her exact shade of dark honey brown, and Salvatore Conti, cold, controlled, feared by men twice his age, felt the entire architecture of his carefully rebuilt life begin, very quietly, to crack. The reception after the funeral was held at the Conti estate in Oyster Bay, a sprawling stone house behind iron gates that Valentina remembered from a lifetime she had tried, and mostly failed, to forget. She had not intended to come, but her father, Don Rocco Moretti, had insisted, with the particular stubbornness of an old man who knew he did not have many more insistencies left in him. "Enzo Conti and I hated each other for 30 years, Rocco had said in the car, his cane resting between his knees, his once broad shoulders now stooped with the illness he refused to name aloud. But hatred in the end is just another kind of intimacy. I owe the old bastard my respect. And you," he'd turned to her, dark eyes softer than she'd seen them in years. "You owe nothing to anyone, Valentina. If you'd rather not come, say the word, and we turn this car around." "I'll come," she'd said. "I need to see it through." She had not told him why. She had not told him about the conversation with Salvatore at the viewing, about the way he'd looked at Matteo like a man trying to solve an equation with pieces that shouldn't fit together and yet somehow, mathematically, did. Now she stood on the edge of the Conti garden with a glass of wine she wasn't drinking, watching her son chase a Conti cousin's spaniel across the lawn with the reckless joy of a child who had no idea he was standing on ground soaked in 3 generations of blood feud, and she felt, for the first time in 7 years, the true weight of what she had done in staying silent. "You look like you're bracing for gunfire," said a voice behind her. She turned. It was Isabella Conti, Salvatore's younger sister, 24 now, though Valentina remembered her as a gangly 17-year-old who used to sneak Valentina's cigarettes behind the pool house and swear undying loyalty to a secret she'd never once threatened to reveal. "Isabella, you're the only person at this entire funeral who looks more nervous than my brother," Isabella said, sliding up beside her with 2 glasses of champagne, handing one over, though Valentina hadn't asked. "And believe me, that's saying something. He's been like a man walking around with a knife between his ribs since he saw you. I didn't come here to upset anyone. I know." Isabella's gaze slid deliberately toward Matteo. "He's beautiful, you know, your son." Valentina's fingers tightened around the champagne flute. "Thank you." "He has Salvatore's exact scowl when he's concentrating," Isabella said, very quietly, very evenly, watching Valentina's face rather than the boy. "I noticed it the second he walked in. I don't think anyone else has looked closely enough yet. But I have eyes, Valentina, and I have memory, and I remember exactly how my brother looked the year you disappeared." The world tilted very slightly beneath Valentina's feet. "Isabella." "I'm not going to say anything," Isabella said. "That's not why I'm telling you I noticed. I'm telling you because you should decide how this comes out and when, before someone less kind than me decides for you. This family does not run on secrets that stay buried, Valentina. You of all people should remember that." Before Valentina could answer, a shadow fell across them both, and she didn't need to look up to know whose it was. She had spent 8 months of her life learning the particular weight of his presence, the way the air seemed to organize itself around him. "Isabella," Salvatore said, "go check on Uncle Marco. He's had 4 scotches and he's telling the Gambini cousin about the Atlantic City thing again." Isabella rolled her eyes, but obeyed, throwing Valentina one last unreadable look before she went. Salvatore stood beside Valentina at the low stone wall overlooking the water, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, far enough that no one watching from the terrace would think anything of it. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Sailboats moved lazily across the sound in the late afternoon light, oblivious to the 2 people standing on the shore with an entire unspoken war between them. "I read the letter you left," Salvatore said finally. Valentina frowned. "What letter?" He turned to look at her properly then, and something in his expression made her stomach drop. "The letter. The one that came a week after you disappeared, handwritten, in your handwriting, telling me it was over, telling me not to look for you, telling me," his jaw tightened, "that you'd gotten what you needed from me, and it was time to go home to your father." "I never wrote that letter," Valentina said. The silence that followed was so absolute she could hear the water lapping against the rocks below them. "What?" "Salvatore, I never wrote you a letter. I never spoke to you again after that night in the apartment, because you told me not to, because you looked at me like I was something you'd scraped off your shoe, and told me you knew what I was. And I was too proud and too broken to beg you to believe me." I left New York 2 weeks later because my father found out about us and gave me an ultimatum I couldn't survive. I never wrote you anything. Salvatore's face had gone the colour of ash. There were photographs, he said, low, almost to himself. A recording. Your voice. My voice saying what? That you were only with me for information. That you were going to use whatever you got and leave. Valentina felt something cold and vast open up beneath her ribs, an old grief reorganizing itself instantly into something far more dangerous. Rage. Someone showed you photographs of me with another man. Someone played you a recording of my voice saying I never loved you. And you believed it. Without asking me. Without one single word to my face, before you ended everything I thought we were building. Valentina, who showed you? She demanded, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake. Who brought you those photographs, Salvatore? Who played you that tape? He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd walked back into his life, Salvatore Conti, cold, controlled, feared, looked entirely, helplessly lost. I don't know, he said. I've never known. It came through a courier, no name. I assumed... He stopped. I assumed it came from within my own house, someone who wanted the alliance broken as badly as our fathers claimed they didn't. Valentina turned to look out at the water, her heart hammering. 7 years of grief and rage and unanswered questions rising in her throat all at once. Somewhere behind them, across the lawn, her son's laughter rang out bright and careless, entirely unaware that he was, at this very moment, becoming the centre of a war that had never actually ended, only gone quiet, waiting, patient as a knife left sheathed. Then we were both lied to, she said finally, by someone who is still, apparently, very good at their job. Salvatore's eyes followed hers to where Matteo played on the lawn, and something in his face, grief, hope, terror, want, all tangled together into an expression Valentina had no name for, made her chest ache with the sudden, unbearable weight of everything she had never told him. Valentina. His voice had dropped to something raw. Whose son is he? She closed her eyes. Not here, she whispered. Please, Salvatore. Not here. She did not tell him that night. She gathered Matteo, made her excuses to her father, and left the Conti estate, with her pulse still hammering from the conversation by the water, promising herself she would find the right moment, the right words, some version of this truth that did not detonate everything at once. The Moretti townhouse on the Upper East Side had been shuttered for years, but her father had opened it again for the funeral season, and it smelled of dust and old cedar, and faintly of the cigars Rocco Moretti was no longer permitted by his doctors to smoke. Valentina tucked Matteo into the guest room that had once been her own childhood bedroom, reading him half a chapter of a book about a knight and a dragon until his breathing evened into sleep. And then she went downstairs to find her father waiting for her in his study with 2 glasses of grappa already poured. You spoke to him, Rocco said. It was not a question. Papa, I saw the way he looked at you across that garden, Valentina. I am dying, not blind. He gestured for her to sit, and though the old man's hands trembled now around his glass in a way they never had when she was young, His eyes were as sharp as ever, cataloguing her exactly the way his enemy's son had catalogued the room at the viewing. "You should have told me you were carrying his child." Valentina's breath caught. "You knew? I am your father. I knew the week you knew." He took a slow sip of grappa. "I said nothing because you had already made your choice, to raise that boy far from this world, away from the Contis, away from me, away from everything that nearly destroyed you at 22. I respected that choice, even when it broke my heart to watch you leave, even when your mother, God rest her, cried herself sick over the grandson she was never allowed to hold." "You could have told me you knew," Valentina said, her voice cracking. "All these years I thought I was protecting a secret only I carried." "And what would you have done if you'd known I knew? Come home sooner? Told Salvatore Conti the truth before you were ready?" Rocco shook his head slowly. "Some secrets are not ours to force open before their time, cara. I learned that the hard way in this business, more times than I care to count." Valentina turned her glass slowly in her fingers, watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. "Someone lied to him, Papa. Someone showed him photographs of me with another man, played him a recording of a voice claiming to be mine, saying I never loved him, that I was only using him for information. He believed it instantly. He ended everything between us that same night, before I ever had the chance to explain." Her father's expression did not change, but something in his stillness sharpened, the particular quiet of a man recalculating an old equation. "And you believe these photographs, this recording, were fabricated?" "I know they were. I never said those words. I was never with another man." Valentina looked up. "Which means someone spent real time, real resources, manufacturing a lie precise enough to destroy us both instantly, without either of us questioning it. That isn't jealousy, Papa. That's strategy." "Strategy requires motive," Rocco said slowly. "Who benefits from a Moretti and a Conti never joining houses?" "Everyone who profits from the war continuing," Valentina said. "Every man who makes his fortune brokering between two families that hate each other. Every cousin who stands to inherit more if the succession stays contested. Every rival family who fears what a true alliance between us would mean for their own territory." Her father was quiet for a long moment. Then, very softly, he said, "Dante." "Uncle Dante, your consigliere. He was against the truce dinner from the very beginning, 7 years ago, argued against it in this very room, said the Contis would use any peace as cover to move against us. When you and the boy fell for each other, he came to me twice asking permission to, his words, resolve the situation before it embarrassed the family." Rocco's jaw tightened. "I told him no both times. I told him it was your heart, and your heart was not his business." "Papa." Valentina's own pulse had gone cold. "Dante has been at every family gathering for 20 years. He was at the reception today. He held Matteo's hand and told him he had a strong grip, like his grandfather." "I know," Rocco said grimly, "which is why we say nothing yet. A wounded traitor who believes himself undiscovered is a careless one. A traitor who knows we suspect him becomes a very dangerous animal indeed. And dangerous animals, Valentina, do not simply run. They strike first." Upstairs, faintly, Valentina heard Matteo shift in his sleep, murmuring something wordless, safe in the assumption that the world he'd been born into was ordinary, was safe, was nothing more complicated than knights and dragons and a mother who loved him without conditions. She thought of Salvatore's face by the water, the raw, unguarded devastation in it when he'd asked whose son Matteo was. She thought of 7 years spent building a quiet, careful life, an ocean away from all of this, and how thoroughly, how completely, one funeral had unmade it in a single afternoon. "I have to tell him," she said, "soon, before anyone else does it for me, in a way designed to hurt us both." Rocco reached across the small table between them and covered her hand with his own, his skin paper-thin now, spotted with age, trembling faintly. "Then tell him with your whole heart, Cara, and no more silence between you. I have watched silence do more damage in this family than any bullet ever has." His eyes, dark and fierce even now, held hers. "Whatever comes of it, whatever the Contis decide when they know the truth, you will not face it alone. Not this time." Valentina pressed her father's hand to her cheek, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something like the beginning of hope. Fragile, dangerous, entirely unearned, and utterly impossible to extinguish now that it had caught. Outside the study window, a car idled at the end of the block for a moment too long before pulling away into the dark, and neither of them noticed it at all. Salvatore did not wait the polite interval convention demanded. 2 days after the funeral, while the flowers on his grandfather's grave were still fresh enough to bruise if touched, he had his driver take him to the Moretti townhouse, and he stood on the front steps of his family's oldest enemy, like a man arriving to collect a debt he intended to be paid in full. It was Rocco Moretti himself who opened the door, leaning on his cane, his sharp eyes taking in Salvatore's presence with something that might almost have been amusement. "Salvatore Conti," Rocco said, "on my doorstep. Your grandfather would be turning in a grave that isn't even settled yet. I need to speak with Valentina." "I imagine you do." Rocco stepped back, gesturing him inside with the particular grace of an old man who had spent a lifetime learning that hospitality and hostility were not, in fact, opposites. "She's in the garden with the boy. I'll have someone bring coffee." The garden behind the townhouse was small by the standards of the estates Salvatore had grown up in. A modest rectangle of green, hemmed by brick walls and a single old oak. But Valentina sat on a stone bench beneath it, with a book open on her lap, and Matteo lay on his stomach in the grass nearby, methodically arranging a small army of plastic soldiers into some private 6-year-old war. She looked up when Salvatore's shadow fell across the grass, and he watched her face do a complicated thing. Surprise, then wariness, then something that looked almost like relief, as though some part of her had been waiting for him to arrive exactly like this, uninvited and unwilling to wait any longer. "Salvatore." "You said not there. We're not there any more." He glanced toward Matteo, who had looked up at the sound of a new voice and was now studying Salvatore with open, unself-conscious curiosity. "Can we talk?" Valentina closed her book. "Matteo, amore, go show nonno your soldiers. I think he'd like to see the battle." The boy scrambled up obligingly and trotted toward the house, pausing once to look back at Salvatore with an expression so achingly familiar, that same assessing tilt of the head, that same refusal to look away first, that Salvatore felt something crack open in his chest before Valentina had said a single word. When the boy was gone, she rose from the bench, smoothing her skirt, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The oak tree above them stirred faintly in the June breeze. "Ask me," Valentina said finally. Salvatore's jaw worked. "How old is he?" "6. He'll be 7 in October." The math was not complicated. Salvatore had done it already, standing in his own bathroom mirror at 3 in the morning 2 nights running, counting backward from the boy's birthday to the last night he had held Valentina in his arms, and the number that came out the other end of that calculation had nearly put him on his knees. "Say it," he said, low. "I need you to say it to me plainly, Valentina. I've spent 7 years telling myself a story about what happened between us, and I need to know exactly how wrong I was." Valentina looked at him, and something in her composure finally, visibly broke. "He's yours, Salvatore. Matteo is your son. I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after you ended things, after someone destroyed us with a lie neither of us questioned. I was 22 years old, cut off from your family entirely and about to be cut off from my own, and I made a choice. I chose to protect him. I took him to Milan. I built a life. I told myself every single day for 7 years that it was the only decent thing I could have done, given everything. And some nights I believed that. And some nights I hated myself for it so completely I couldn't breathe." Salvatore stood very still, and for a long moment the only sound in the garden was the distant murmur of the city beyond the brick walls, and his own blood roaring in his ears. "7 years," he said finally. "You let me believe he didn't exist for 7 years." "I let myself believe you didn't want to know," Valentina said, her voice fracturing. "You told me you knew what I was, Salvatore. You told me not to contact you again. What was I supposed to do? Arrive at your door pregnant and unwanted, begging a man who had just called me a liar and a spy to believe I was carrying his child?" "You could have tried." "I did try. I tried for 2 weeks after you ended it, Salvatore. I called, I wrote, I even came to your building once, and your own men turned me away at the door because you'd given the order yourself that I wasn't to be let anywhere near you." Her voice had risen now, raw with 7 years of grief finally given permission to surface. "You didn't want to hear from me. You made that unmistakably, viciously clear. So I stopped trying, and I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was survive, and raise my son somewhere the Contis and the Morettis couldn't reach him." Salvatore's hands had curled into fists at his sides, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something dangerous and low, not aimed at her, but at himself, at the version of himself who had made all of this possible with one act of unquestioning fury 7 years ago. "I have a son," he said, as if testing the words for the first time, tasting how impossibly they sat in his mouth. "I have had a son for 6 years, and I never knew. I missed." He stopped, his composure finally, visibly, cracking down the centre. "I missed everything, Valentina. His first steps, his first word, every birthday, every night he was sick, every time he needed someone, and I wasn't there, because I believed a lie some coward fed me through a courier with no name." "I know," Valentina whispered. I've grieved that too, every single day." He looked at her then, and the fury in his eyes was not for her. She understood that instantly, with a certainty that steadied something in her chest that had been shaking since the moment he'd arrived. It was for himself, and for whoever had engineered this catastrophe, and it burned with an intensity that made her almost afraid for whoever had done this once they were finally, inevitably, found. "I am not going to lose one more day of his life," Salvatore said, "and I am not going to lose one more day of yours either. Not to lies, not to old wars, not to anyone." Valentina felt her eyes fill, 7 years of careful protective distance, finally, dangerously giving way. "Salvatore, whoever did this to us," he said, "is going to answer for it. But that's a fight for another day. Today," his voice broke, just slightly, just enough that she heard the boy he had been at 26, before the world had taught him to be this cold, careful man. "Today I would like, if you'll allow it, to meet my son." They found Matteo in the front hall, kneeling on the Persian runner, deep in negotiations with his grandfather over the strategic disposition of his plastic army across the pattern's faded medallions. Rocco Moretti sat in his armchair like a general reviewing a map, utterly absorbed, and for a moment Valentina simply watched the two of them together, the dying Don and the small boy who did not yet know how much of his blood ran through both of the families that had spent decades trying to destroy each other. "Matteo," Valentina said softly, "there's someone who'd like to meet you properly." The boy looked up, and his dark eyes, her eyes, and yet, Salvatore thought, also unmistakably his own mother's eyes, the particular shape of them, moved between his mother and the tall stranger in the doorway, with open, unguarded curiosity. "You're the man from the funeral," Matteo said. "You looked sad." Salvatore's throat worked. He crouched, slowly, bringing himself down to the boy's height, an instinct he had not known he possessed until this exact moment. "I was sad. My grandfather died. But I'm not sad right now." "Why not?" "Because I just found out something wonderful," Salvatore said, and his voice, to Valentina's astonishment, did not shake at all, though she could see the effort it cost him to keep it steady. "I found out I have a son, and I think, if it's all right with you, that son might be you." Matteo's small face went very still, processing this with the particular gravity children bring to information that reorganizes their entire understanding of the world. He looked to his mother. "Mama, is that true?" Valentina knelt beside Salvatore, taking her son's hands in both of hers. "It's true, tesoro. This is your papa. His name is Salvatore. I should have told you sooner. I should have told you both sooner, and I'm sorry it took so long." Matteo studied Salvatore for a long, unblinking moment, and Salvatore found himself holding his breath in a way he could not remember doing since he was a very young man, waiting to hear whether his own father approved of some decision that had mattered to him more than his pride would ever admit. "Do you know how to play soldiers?" Matteo asked, finally. Something in Salvatore's chest that had been clenched tight as a fist for 7 years, unclenched all at once, so suddenly it was almost painful, like blood returning to a limb that had gone numb. "I used to be very good at it," he said, "though I should warn you, I always played fair, even when I was losing." Nonno cheats, Matteo said solemnly, and behind them Rocco made an offended noise that fooled precisely no one, least of all his own great-grandson. I do not cheat, Rocco said. I employ superior strategy. You moved my general when I wasn't looking. A superior general anticipates being moved. Salvatore laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, the first one Valentina had heard from him since she'd returned to New York, and the sound of it did something dangerous to her heart, cracking open 7 years of carefully maintained distance in a single, unguarded moment. He lowered himself the rest of the way to the floor, folding his long frame down beside his son with an ease that suggested he had simply, instantly decided this was where he belonged now, and began arranging a flank of soldiers with the same absolute focus he brought to every negotiation Valentina had ever watched him conduct. Rocco caught Valentina's eye over the boy's dark head, and something passed between them. Old grief, cautious hope, the particular ache of watching a wound begin, tentatively, to close. They played for nearly an hour. Salvatore lost, spectacularly and repeatedly, to what Matteo assured him was superior strategy learned entirely from his great-grandfather, and bore each defeat with a gravity that made the boy laugh so hard he had to lie flat on the rug to recover. Valentina watched from the doorway, arms crossed, unable to stop the tears that kept threatening at the corners of her eyes, watching her son's face light with a particular kind of joy she had never seen on it before, the specific, irreplaceable joy of a child discovering his father. When at last Matteo's eyelids began to droop, worn out by the emotional weight of a day too large for a 6-year-old to fully process, Salvatore carried him upstairs himself, refusing Valentina's offer to take him, cradling his son's small weight against his chest with a careful, fierce tenderness that undid her completely. He laid Matteo down in the guest-room bed, pulled the blanket up to his chin, and stood there a long moment, simply watching him breathe, the way new parents do, the way Salvatore had never had the chance to do before now. "He's beautiful," Salvatore said quietly, when Valentina joined him in the doorway. God, Valentina, he's perfect. And I missed 6 years of him existing." "I know. I'm not angry at you." He turned to look at her, and his eyes in the dim hallway light were dark with an emotion too complicated to name in a single word. "I want you to know that. I understand why you did what you did. I gave you no other choice. But I need you to understand something in return." "What?" "I am never letting either of you out of my sight again," Salvatore said, and though his voice was quiet, there was iron beneath it, the particular unbending quality she remembered from every negotiation she'd ever watched him win. "Not because I don't trust you, because I don't trust whoever did this to us the first time, and I will not risk my son, my family, paying the price for my failure to protect you both a second time." Valentina's breath caught. "Salvatore, we don't even know yet if—" "I know enough," he said. "Someone destroyed my life once with a lie precise enough to fool me completely. That person is still out there, Valentina, still moving in rooms close enough to touch us both. And I intend to find them before they decide to finish what they started." Don Enzo Conti's will was read 6 days after his funeral in the wood-panelled library of the Oyster Bay estate, before an audience that included every ranking member of the Conti family, and, to the visible shock of half the room, Rocco Moretti and his daughter. My grandfather, Salvatore said, standing at the head of the room in his father's absence. His father, Massimo Conti, had been dead 4 years now, killed in a rival hit that had never been fully avenged, which was the reason Salvatore had spent the last 4 years as the family's de facto head, despite his youth. Left specific instructions regarding certain provisions of his estate, provisions that concern the Morettis directly. The lawyer, a thin, precise man named Whitfield, who had served the Conti family for 30 years, cleared his throat and began to read. The bulk of it was expected: properties, accounts, the transfer of formal authority to Salvatore as the family's new head. But near the end, Whitfield paused, glanced up at the assembled room with the particular discomfort of a man about to detonate something he had known was coming for years, and continued. To Rocco Moretti, my oldest enemy, and, in certain private correspondence found among my papers, my oldest friend. I leave the deed to the property on X Street, known as the Bellamy Warehouse, jointly held, on the condition that our two families undertake, within 1 calendar year of my death, formal negotiations toward a lasting territorial peace. The peace I spent 30 years too proud and too stubborn to broker myself, and which I now understand, facing my own mortality, was the single greatest failure of my life. A murmur went through the room like wind through dry grass. Rocco Moretti sat very still, his weathered face unreadable, though Valentina, sitting beside him, felt his hand tighten almost imperceptibly on the head of his cane. "There's more," Whitfield said, and something in his tone made Salvatore's stomach tighten with foreboding. "I am aware," the lawyer read, "that my grandson Salvatore and Rocco's daughter Valentina once loved each other, and that this love was destroyed by a lie so effective I have long suspected it was engineered by someone within our own houses who profits from our continued war. I did not act on this suspicion in my lifetime, out of cowardice I am not proud of. I ask now that my grandson and Rocco's daughter, if fate has seen fit to bring them back into each other's orbit, as I suspect this reading of my will may do, undertake what I could not. Find the truth, and build, from its wreckage, something neither of our families has managed in 3 generations. Peace, and perhaps, if I am permitted one final indulgence as a dying old fool, love." The library had gone utterly silent. Salvatore felt every eye in the room swing toward him and Valentina, and beside him he heard his uncle Vittorio, his father's younger brother, silver-haired and sharp-featured, who had served as consigliere since Massimo's death, make a small, disapproving sound in his throat. "This is absurd," Vittorio said. "Enzo was dying, medicated, hardly of sound mind. The will was drafted and witnessed 18 months ago," Whitfield said crisply. "Well before your father's final illness, Vittorio. At a time 3 separate physicians attest he was of entirely sound mind. I have the documentation, should anyone wish to contest it." Vittorio's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, and Valentina, watching him carefully, remembering her father's suspicions, remembering 7 years of silence, felt a small, cold prickle of unease she could not yet name. "There is a practical dimension to this," Whitfield continued, addressing the room now more broadly. "The Bellamy Warehouse sits on contested territory both families have disputed for 2 decades. The exact fault line, in fact, along which most of the violence between your houses has historically occurred. Don Conti's condition requires both families to jointly administer this property, which will necessitate regular contact between representatives of the Conti and Moretti organizations for the foreseeable future. Practically speaking, gentlemen, this means the peace Don Conti requested is not merely a suggestion. It is, structurally, unavoidable. Rocco Moretti rose slowly from his chair, leaning on his cane, and for a long moment he simply looked across the room at the assembled Contis, men who had been his sworn enemies for 30 years, men whose fathers had killed his men, and whose men his fathers had killed in turn, a ledger of blood so long neither side could any longer say who had started it or why it mattered. "Enzo Conti," Rocco said finally, his voice carrying the particular gravity of a man who understood he did not have many more speeches left in him, "was a bastard and a thief and the single most stubborn man I have ever had the misfortune to hate for 3 decades. He was also, in the end, right about one thing I have been too proud to admit myself." He turned, deliberately, to look at Valentina, and then, past her, to where Salvatore stood at the head of the room. "This war has cost both our families more than either of us can any longer afford to pay. I am dying, Salvatore Conti, perhaps more slowly than your grandfather did, but dying all the same. I do not intend to leave this earth having done nothing to end what my own father and his father before him spent their whole lives perpetuating." "Then we agree," Salvatore said, and his eyes found Valentina's across the room, holding them with an intensity that made her chest ache. "We agree to honor my grandfather's terms, formal negotiations, a lasting peace, and," his voice dropped, quieter now, meant for her alone, though the whole room could hear it, "an investigation into who benefited most from keeping us apart in the first place." Vittorio's expression, Valentina noticed, had gone very carefully, deliberately blank. After the reading concluded and the room began to empty, murmuring in clusters of shock and speculation, Valentina found herself intercepted in the corridor by Isabella, who drew her aside with a hand on her elbow and a look of genuine alarm. "Did you see Uncle Vittorio's face?" Isabella whispered. "When Whitfield read the part about the lie, he looked like he'd swallowed glass." "I saw it." "Valentina." Isabella's grip on her arm tightened. "I've known that man my whole life. I've never once seen him look afraid. Not at my father's funeral, not when we lost the Bronx territory, not ever. He looked afraid just now, and I don't think it was grief." Valentina glanced back through the library doorway, where Vittorio Conti stood very still amid the departing crowd, his sharp eyes fixed on nothing at all, his hands folded behind his back in a posture of perfect, practiced calm that did not, she now understood, extend anywhere near his eyes. The negotiations Whitfield had promised began, formally, at a club called Aurelia, on the border between Conti and Moretti territory. Neutral ground, technically owned by neither family, though everyone in the room understood that neutral, in this world, was simply a polite word for watched by both sides equally. Valentina had not planned to attend. The first session was meant to be strictly business, lawyers, accountants, the dry mechanics of jointly administering a warehouse neither family particularly wanted, but neither could afford to relinquish to the other. But Salvatore had called her personally, his voice low and certain over the phone, in a way that had made something in her chest tighten pleasantly, despite herself. "Come," he'd said, Not for the business, for the room. I want the Contis to see you sitting beside me as an equal, not as a ghost from a story they've told themselves about our family's history. I want them to understand this is not a temporary arrangement. She had worn dark green, not consciously, she told herself, dressing in her father's townhouse with Matteo already asleep down the hall in the care of the housekeeper. Though some deep, unerased part of her memory had chosen the colour of the dress she'd worn the night Salvatore Conti first told her he was worried about her, 7 years and 1 lifetime ago. The club's private upper floor was all dark wood and low gold light. A long table set for 12, lawyers and lieutenants from both families, arranged with the careful, deliberate symmetry of men who had spent their whole careers reading a room for threat. Salvatore rose when she entered, and something in the way his eyes moved over her, appreciation, want, and something fiercer beneath both, made every conversation at the table falter for just a moment before resuming. The negotiations themselves were tedious, procedural, exactly as dry as she'd expected, until, near the end of the evening, when the formal business had concluded and the room had loosened into the low murmur of drinks and cautious, testing conversation between two families still uncertain how much civility to extend each other. A man Valentina did not recognize approached her at the bar. He was handsome in an obvious, expensive way, an associate of some cousin family whose name she'd already forgotten, and he leaned against the bar beside her with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life been told no. "Valentina Moretti," he said, "I've heard stories about you for years. None of them did you justice." "That's kind," she said, already scanning the room for an exit from the conversation. "I heard you've been in Milan. Fashion, was it? Or was that just the rumour men told each other because they couldn't imagine a reason a woman like you would leave New York voluntarily?" "I left for my own reasons," Valentina said, her tone cooling several degrees, "none of which concern you." "Feisty," he smiled, leaning a fraction closer, and Valentina felt the old, familiar irritation of a man who mistook a woman's coolness for a game rather than an answer. "I like that. Have dinner with me, somewhere the whole family isn't watching." "I don't think she's already taken." Salvatore's voice arrived a half-second before he did, low and utterly without warmth, and Valentina turned to find him standing directly behind her, close enough that his hand settled at the small of her back with a possessiveness that should have irritated her, and instead sent an unwelcome, traitorous heat through her whole body. The man at the bar straightened, some instinct for self-preservation finally kicking in as he took in the full weight of Salvatore Conti's expression. "Conti, I didn't realize—" "You didn't ask," Salvatore said, "and you should have. Get another drink, somewhere else in the room." The man went, with the particular haste of a man who had just recognized, belatedly, exactly whose territory he'd wandered onto. Valentina turned to Salvatore, arching an eyebrow despite the traitorous warmth still humming beneath her skin. "I don't need you to fight my battles for me, Salvatore. I've been handling men like that on my own for a decade." "I know you have." His hand stayed at her back, warm through the thin fabric of her dress, and his eyes, when they met hers, were dark, unguarded in a way she had rarely seen him allow in public. "That's not why I did it." "Then why?" Because I have spent 7 years imagining 100 different versions of the man you might have built a life with, Salvatore said, low, for her ears alone. And every single one of those imagined men made me want to burn something down. I am not. He stopped, visibly reining himself in, though the effort cost him something she could see in the tight line of his jaw. I am not a reasonable man where you're concerned, Valentina. I never was. I thought 7 years might have changed that. It hasn't. Her heart was hammering now, dangerously, traitorously fast. Salvatore, dance with me, he said, and it was not quite a question. She should have said no. Every rational instinct she had cultivated over 7 years of careful, controlled solitude told her to say no, to step back, to remember exactly how catastrophically it had ended the last time she let this man's hand rest against her skin and believed, foolishly, that it meant safety rather than danger. But the small band at the far end of the room had begun something slow and low, and Salvatore's hand had slid from her back to her waist with a gentleness that undid every rational instinct she possessed, and she found herself following him onto the small cleared space near the windows before she had consciously decided to move at all. He danced the way he always had, badly, technically, all instinct and no training, though he moved her with a confidence that made the mechanics of it entirely irrelevant. Their bodies fit together the way they always had, effortlessly, dangerously familiar, and when he bent his head to speak against her ear, his voice had dropped to something rough and low that she felt in her spine more than heard. I have thought about this, he murmured, more nights than I can count. Just this, your hand in mine, nothing else. Salvatore, we can't. I know what we can't do, he said. I know exactly how complicated this is, Valentina. Our fathers, our history, whoever destroyed us the first time, still out there, still watching. I know all of it. His hand tightened at her waist, drawing her fractionally closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him through the thin silk of her dress. But I am done pretending I don't want you. I wanted you at 26 with a recklessness that terrified me, and I have wanted you every single day of the 7 years since, whether or not I was willing to admit it to myself. That has not changed. If anything, it's gotten worse. Across the room, half hidden behind a pillar, Vittorio Conti watched his nephew's hand settle at Valentina Moretti's waist with an expression that, had either of them been looking, would have told them everything they needed to know about exactly how dangerous his silence had already become. The car came for Matteo 3 days later, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while he was walking with his nanny, a quiet, capable young woman named Carla, whom Rocco had hired years ago and trusted absolutely, the 2 blocks from his new private school to the townhouse. It happened fast, the way these things always did, in the stories Valentina had grown up hearing whispered in her own house as a child, stories she had never truly believed could apply to her own son, until the moment Carla burst through the front door, white-faced and screaming Valentina's name, her sleeve torn, a bruise already darkening along her cheekbone. "They took him," Carla sobbed. "A car pulled up, 2 men. I fought, I swear to God I fought, but there were 2 of them and I couldn't." The next several minutes existed for Valentina only in fragments afterward, in the way trauma always compressed itself into disconnected images rather than continuous memory. Her own scream, raw and animal, tearing out of her before she'd consciously decided to make a sound. Her father, grey-faced, already reaching for the phone with hands that shook and yet dialed with perfect, practiced speed. Salvatore's name, said aloud by someone, and then Salvatore himself, arriving at the townhouse in under 11 minutes. She would learn later he had been 2 blocks away already, having lunch with Isabella, and had simply abandoned the table mid-sentence and run. "Tell me everything," Salvatore said to Carla, crouching in front of her chair with a gentleness that did not match the murderous stillness in his eyes. Every detail. The car, the men, anything. Black sedan. New York plates, I think. I only saw part of the number. I remember a 7 and a 2. Carla's voice shook. One of the men had an accent, not Italian, Eastern European maybe. He said... She stopped, swallowing hard. He said, "Tell them this is a message. The Contis and Morettis don't get to make peace, not while we're still owed what we're owed." Salvatore went very still. We. That's what he said. We. Rocco, still on the phone with what Valentina now understood was a network of men she had never known her father still commanded even in his illness, covered the receiver with one trembling hand. "The Baron family," he said grimly. "It has to be. They've operated on the fringes of both our territories for a decade, buying up whatever we won't defend, waiting for exactly this kind of instability to expand their own reach." "The Barons don't have the resources to plan something this precise," Salvatore said. "Photographs, 7 years ago, a recording. Now this, timed exactly to the moment we've begun real negotiations. This isn't the Barons acting alone. Someone is feeding them information. Someone inside one of our own houses." Valentina, who had been standing frozen by the window since the moment she'd understood what Carla was telling them, finally found her voice, and it came out low and terrible, entirely unlike anything she had heard herself sound like before. "I don't care whose fault this is right now. I care about finding my son. Everything else can wait." Salvatore crossed the room in 3 strides and took her by both shoulders, forcing her to look at him, his eyes burning with an intensity that cut through the panic threatening to swallow her whole. "Look at me, Valentina. We are going to find him. I promise you that with everything I am. But I need you to breathe, because panic is exactly what whoever did this wants from us, and I refuse to give it to them." "How can you be so calm?" "I am not calm," Salvatore said, low and fierce. "I am the furthest thing from calm that I have ever been in my entire life. But I have spent my whole existence learning how to function through terror, because that is what this life demands of us. And right now, that boy needs a father who can think clearly enough to find him, not one who is on his knees screaming at the sky. So I am going to think, and you are going to help me. Because you know this world too, Valentina, whether you wanted to or not. And right now, I need every piece of knowledge you have." Something in his voice, the raw, unbreakable certainty of it, cut through Valentina's panic just enough for her training, her own upbringing in this world, to reassert itself. She wiped her eyes, straightened, and nodded once, sharp. "The Baroness ran their New York operations out of 2 locations I know of," she said. "A social club on Arthur Avenue that's mostly cover, and the shipping warehouse near the Hunts Point Market that does the actual work. If they're holding him for leverage rather than for a message they've already delivered, they'll keep him somewhere they control completely. My money's on the warehouse. Salvatore was already moving, phone at his ear, barking orders to men Valentina recognized from the funeral. Conti soldiers, mobilizing with the terrifying, practiced efficiency of an organization built for exactly this kind of crisis. Rocco, despite his illness, was doing the same from his own chair, his voice gaining strength with every word. 7 years of retirement burning away in the face of his grandson's danger to reveal the Don he had once been in full. "I'm coming with you," Valentina said when Salvatore ended his call. "Valentina, he is my son," she said, and there was iron in it now, the same iron she had heard in Salvatore's voice a moment before. "I am not sitting in this house while other people go find him. I know how to shoot Salvatore. You taught me yourself a lifetime ago. I am coming." He looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and helpless and deeply, achingly proud moving behind his eyes, and then he nodded once, sharp. "Stay behind me, exactly behind me, at all times. If anything happens, nothing is going to happen to either of us," Valentina said, "because we are going to get our son back, and then we are going to find whoever is responsible for this, and I promise you, Salvatore Conti, I will not rest until they answer for every single thing they have taken from us." Outside, the black cars were already pulling up to the curb, engines running, a small army assembling in the golden late afternoon light to go to war for a 6-year-old boy who, at that exact moment, sat frightened and alone in the back room of a warehouse near the Hunts Point market, clutching a small plastic soldier he had managed to slip into his pocket that morning, whispering to himself, the way his mother had taught him to whisper when he was scared, that everything was going to be all right. The warehouse near Hunts Point sat low and dark against the evening sky, ringed by chain-link fencing and the particular industrial silence of a district that emptied out entirely after 5 o'clock, leaving whole blocks abandoned to exactly the kind of business best conducted where no one was watching. Salvatore's men moved on it with a precision that Valentina, riding in the back seat of an armoured SUV beside him, a borrowed pistol cold and steady in her hand, recognized from a childhood spent half understanding the machinery of her own family's operations. 6 vehicles, approaching from 3 directions, radios silent, headlights dark for the final quarter mile. "There are only 3 ways in or out of that building," Salvatore said, studying a floor plan one of his men had pulled up on a tablet, his voice low and utterly focused, every trace of the earlier terror in his eyes replaced now by something colder and infinitely more dangerous. "Loading dock at the north end, personnel door on the east side, and a fire exit that opens onto the rail spur. If they're smart, they've got the loading dock covered heaviest. We go through the personnel door and the fire exit simultaneously." "And if they're not smart?" Valentina asked. "Then this is easier than it should be, and we still don't relax until Matteo is in this car." Salvatore's eyes flicked to her, and something passed between them, wordless and absolute, the shared, unbearable weight of 2 parents about to walk toward gunfire for the sake of a child neither of them had known to protect together until 11 days ago. "You stay in this vehicle, Valentina." "Salvatore, I need you safe," he said, and his voice cracked just slightly on the word safe, the first crack she had seen in his composure since Carla had come screaming through the townhouse door. "I cannot lose both of you in the same hour. I need you here, where I know exactly where you are, so that when I bring him out to this car, you are the first thing he sees." She wanted to argue. Every instinct in her screamed to be moving toward her son, not waiting behind bulletproof glass while other people risked their lives for him. But she understood, too, the particular mathematics of this moment, the way Salvatore needed to know she was safe in order to move with his full attention on the building, rather than divided between her safety and Matteo's. She nodded once and watched him disappear into the dark with a dozen armed men, her heart hammering so violently she could feel it in her throat. What followed existed for her, waiting in that car, as an agony measured entirely in radio static and distant, muffled sounds she could not fully interpret. A shout once cut short. A short, sharp exchange of gunfire that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and felt to Valentina like the entire length of her 7 years of exile compressed into a single, unbearable stretch of silence afterward. Then, through the radio, "We're in. 2 hostiles down, 3 secured. Searching the interior now." Valentina's hand closed so hard around the pistol in her lap that her knuckles ached. She counted her own heartbeats, unable to stop, unable to do anything at all except wait and pray, in a language she had not used sincerely since she was a child kneeling beside her mother in a church pew, that God still listened to women who had spent 7 years lying to protect the people she loved. "Found him." The voice on the radio was different now, rougher, and something in it made Valentina's whole body go loose with a relief so total it was almost pain. "Small room off the loading dock. He's okay. He's scared, but he's okay." She was out of the car before she had consciously decided to move, running across broken asphalt toward the warehouse's east entrance, despite every instruction Salvatore had given her, and she met them coming out. Salvatore himself, cradling Matteo against his chest, with the same fierce, careful tenderness he had shown carrying the boy up the stairs to bed less than 2 weeks before. Matteo's small arms locked around his father's neck, his face pressed into Salvatore's shoulder, both of them alive, both of them whole. "Mama!" Matteo's voice broke on the word, and Salvatore set him down just enough for the boy to launch himself into Valentina's arms, and she went down on her knees on the cracked pavement, holding her son so tightly she felt his ribs beneath her hands, sobbing into his hair without any attempt at the composure her whole life had trained into her. "I'm here, tesoro. I'm here. You're safe. I've got you. I've got you." "They said mean things," Matteo whispered against her neck, shaking. "About you and Papa. I didn't understand it all, but I remembered what you taught me, Mama. I stayed brave. I whispered it to myself, like you said." Valentina pulled back just enough to look at her son's face, tear-streaked and exhausted, but unmistakably, miraculously, unharmed. And something in her chest broke open with love so fierce it frightened her. "You were so brave, baby. So brave. I am so proud of you." Salvatore knelt beside them both on the cold pavement, one large hand coming to rest against the back of Matteo's head, the other tentatively finding Valentina's shoulder, and for a long moment the three of them simply stayed there together, a small, broken, miraculous family, kneeling in the wreckage of a warehouse where a war they had not started had nearly taken everything from them a second time. "Who did this?" Valentina asked finally, when she trusted her voice again. "The 3 men your soldiers secured. Do they know?" "They're Barone soldiers," Salvatore said grimly, rising, lifting Matteo gently back into his arms as the boy's exhaustion finally overtook his fear. Low level. They won't know who's actually pulling the strings above them, but one of them said something before he stopped talking. His jaw tightened. He said someone paid them in advance, 3 weeks ago, before any of us knew Valentina and Matteo were even coming to New York for the funeral. Valentina went cold. 3 weeks ago? That's before my father even told me about Enzo's death. Which means, Salvatore said, his voice dropping into something low and lethal, whoever is behind this knew you were coming before you did. Which means it's someone with access to information inside your own house, Valentina. Someone who has been watching you for a very long time. Behind them, in the dark cab of a delivery truck parked 3 blocks from the warehouse's perimeter, a man lowered a pair of binoculars, watched the small, embracing family in the wash of the SUV's headlights, and dialed a number he had used only twice before in his life. Both times at moments exactly like this one, when a plan had failed and a new one needed to be set immediately, quietly, irrevocably into motion. Salvatore moved Valentina and Matteo into his penthouse that same night, and this time she did not argue. The building occupied the top 4 floors of a converted warehouse in Tribeca, all exposed brick and steel and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson, secured by a private elevator, a rotating detail of Conti men, and, Valentina noted, with a mixture of gratitude and unease she did not fully examine, a level of protection that made her father's townhouse look like an open door by comparison. Matteo, exhausted past the point of fear, fell asleep in the back of the car on the drive over, and did not wake even when Salvatore carried him inside and laid him in the guest room adjoining what had clearly, until that morning, been Salvatore's private study. A room that Valentina realized, with a small ache, he must have had his staff convert into a child's bedroom in the 2 hours between the rescue and their arrival, because there was already a small bed made up with soft blankets, a nightlight shaped like a lighthouse plugged into the wall socket, and, incongruously, a brand new set of plastic soldiers arranged neatly on the dresser. "You did all this today," Valentina said quietly, standing in the doorway, watching Salvatore tuck the blanket around their sleeping son with the same careful tenderness she had watched him show at the townhouse. "I had it done while we were driving to the warehouse," Salvatore said, not looking up. "I told myself it was preparation in case we needed somewhere safer for him to stay while we sorted out who was responsible. I didn't let myself think too hard about what it meant that I was already imagining him living here." "Salvatore." He straightened finally, and in the soft lighthouse glow, his face looked younger somehow, stripped of the cold composure he wore like armor in every room outside this one. "I know it's fast. I know we haven't... that there's so much between us we haven't resolved, so much time we lost, and I'm not trying to pretend any of that away by buying a nightlight." His voice roughened. "But I am not letting either of you out of a building I can secure completely. Not after today. Not after what almost happened." Valentina crossed the small distance between them, close enough now that she could see the exhaustion etched beneath his eyes, the particular hollowed-out look of a man who had spent the day nearly losing everything that mattered to him twice over. "Thank you," she said softly, "for finding him, for all of this." "Don't thank me." His jaw tightened. "He's my son. I would have burned that entire warehouse to the ground with my bare hands, if that's what it took." "I know you would have." She reached up, unable to stop herself, and pressed her palm gently against his cheek, feeling the rough stubble beneath her fingers, the faint tremor still running through him that his voice had not betrayed. "You were terrifying today, Salvatore, and I have never in my life felt so safe." Something in his expression cracked open at that. 7 years of carefully maintained distance finally, entirely giving way. And he turned his face into her palm, closing his eyes, breathing her in like a man who had spent a decade underwater, finally allowed to surface. "I have wanted to touch you again since the moment I saw you at the funeral," he said, low, rough, his eyes still closed. "I have told myself 100 reasons why I shouldn't, that it's too fast, that there's too much unresolved between us, that some traitor is still out there watching, waiting to use anything they can against us. I have told myself all of it, Valentina, and none of it has made me want you 1 degree less." "Salvatore, tell me to stop," he said, opening his eyes now, dark and burning and utterly without artifice. "And I will. I will put every wall back up that I've spent 7 years building, and I will love you from a careful, respectable distance, for as long as it takes for you to trust me again. But if you don't tell me to stop—" She kissed him. It was not gentle. 7 years of grief and longing and rage and unanswered questions poured into it, both of them clutching at each other in the soft lighthouse glow of their son's borrowed bedroom, like 2 people who had spent a decade drowning and had just, impossibly, found air. Salvatore's hands framed her face with a reverence that contradicted the desperate heat of his mouth against hers, and Valentina felt something in her chest that had been frozen solid for 7 years, finally, catastrophically, begin to thaw. "I never stopped," she whispered against his mouth when they finally broke apart enough to breathe. "That's the truth I never told you, Salvatore. Not once in 7 years, in Milan with an ocean and a lie between us, I never stopped loving you. I told myself I had to, for my own survival, for Matteo's sake, and I was lying to myself the entire time." "I know exactly how that feels," Salvatore said, his forehead resting against hers, his breath still unsteady. "I built an entire life around the story that I hated you, told myself I hated you every single day for 7 years. And the moment I saw you standing at my grandfather's funeral, every single lie I'd told myself came apart in about 4 seconds." They stood together in the doorway of their son's room for a long moment, foreheads pressed together, hands still tangled in each other's clothing, neither of them willing yet to let go of the fragile, dangerous thing they had just, finally, allowed themselves to reclaim. "We still have to find who did this," Valentina said finally, softly. "Whoever it is, they're not finished, not after today failed." "I know." Salvatore drew back, just enough to look at her properly, his expression sobering, the cold, controlled dawn reasserting itself, even as his hand remained tangled with hers. "Tomorrow, we start looking properly. Tonight—" His voice dropped, warm again, achingly gentle. "Tonight, just for a few hours, I would like to simply be a man who found the woman he loved and the son he never knew he had, all in the same impossible month, and not think about anything else at all." Outside the tall windows, the city lights reflected off the black surface of the Hudson like scattered coins thrown into dark water. And somewhere across that same skyline, in an office lit only by the glow of a single desk lamp, Vittorio Conti sat with a phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent, arranging the next move in a game he had been playing patiently, invisibly, for 7 long years. The investigation began the following morning at the kitchen table of Salvatore's penthouse, over coffee that went cold twice, while Salvatore, Valentina, Isabella, and, arriving at 10 o'clock precisely, leaning heavily on his cane but sharp-eyed and utterly undeterred by his illness, Rocco Moretti laid out everything they knew across the polished marble like pieces of a puzzle none of them had wanted to solve. 7 years ago, Valentina said, someone fabricated photographs and a recording precise enough to end our relationship in a single night without either of us questioning it for a moment. That takes resources. Access to my likeness, my voice, enough knowledge of both our lives to make the lie land exactly where it would do the most damage. And whoever did it, Salvatore added, knew you were returning to New York for my grandfather's funeral before your own father told you the news, which means they have, or had, a source close enough to your family, Valentina, to know your movements before you did. Or close enough to yours, Isabella said quietly, to know when the funeral would be scheduled and to plan around it. Rocco set down his coffee cup with the particular deliberateness of an old man weighing a suspicion he did not want to voice aloud. I have already told Valentina I suspect Dante. He argued against the original truce dinner 7 years ago. He came to me twice asking permission to, his words, resolve the situation between you and Salvatore before it embarrassed the family. I said no both times. But a man who asks permission for something and is refused does not always simply abandon the plan. Dante Ricci, Salvatore repeated slowly. Your consigliere. For 20 years, Rocco said grimly. Which is precisely why I have said nothing to him directly. A cornered animal that does not yet know it is cornered is far easier to watch than one that has been warmed. There's someone on our side worth watching just as closely, Isabella said, and something in her voice made the whole table go still. She glanced at Salvatore, visibly bracing herself. Uncle Vittorio. Salvatore's jaw tightened. Isabella, I know he's family. I know it feels like a betrayal even to say his name in this context. But think about it, Salvatore. He was against the truce dinner from the beginning too. I remember him arguing with Nonno about it, years before you and Valentina even met, saying a Moretti alliance would weaken our territorial claims in the long run. He's the one who's run our organization's day-to-day operations since Papa died, which means he's had 4 years of unsupervised access to every account, every communication channel, every piece of infrastructure that would make fabricating something like those photographs entirely possible. And you saw his face at the will reading when Whitfield read the part about the lie. I've known that man my whole life. He looked afraid. Being uncomfortable with an accusation isn't proof of guilt, Salvatore said, though Valentina could see the effort it cost him to defend a man he clearly did not fully trust himself. Vittorio has served this family loyally for 30 years. He grieved my father as hard as any of us. He's the one who held this organization together when Papa died, and I was too young and too raw with grief to lead. I'm not saying I'm certain, Isabella said. I'm saying we can't afford to rule him out simply because ruling him out is easier to live with. Valentina, who had been quiet through most of this exchange, studying the pattern of the marble beneath her coffee cup, finally spoke. Whoever did this benefits specifically from our two families remaining enemies. Not from either family individually gaining power, from the war itself continuing. That's a narrower motive than simple ambition. It points towards someone who profits from the ongoing conflict in a way that a genuine peace would directly threaten. Meaning? Salvatore asked. Meaning someone who occupies a position that only exists because the war exists, Valentina said slowly, working it through as she spoke. A consigliere whose value to the family rests partly on his ability to navigate conflict. A man like that has less to offer in peacetime. A cousin who manages territory disputes that would simply evaporate if both families formally reconciled. Someone whose entire currency within the family is the ongoing state of hostility itself. The table went quiet. Rocco's eyes had narrowed with a particular sharpness Valentina remembered from childhood. The look he wore when a piece of a larger puzzle clicked suddenly, uncomfortably, into place. Dante's entire value to my organization, he said slowly, has always been his skill at managing the war. Territory disputes, retaliations, the complicated arithmetic of decades-old grudges. If the Contis and Morettis formally reconciled, he'd become obsolete, Valentina finished. A relic of a conflict that no longer exists. And Vittorio, Salvatore said, his voice low now, working through the same terrible logic, has spent 4 years consolidating control over every operational channel in this family, specifically because my father's death and my own inexperience left a vacuum he was uniquely positioned to fill. A genuine peace with the Morettis would mean scrutiny. Joint oversight of shared territory, transparency he has not had to answer to in 4 years. We need proof, Isabella said, not theories. If we move against either of them without absolute certainty, we risk destroying an innocent man's reputation, or worse, tipping off the actual traitor before we're ready. Then we get proof, Salvatore said, rising from the table with the particular cold focus Valentina remembered from every negotiation she had ever watched him win. Discreetly. I want financial records, every account Vittorio has touched in the last 7 years, every transfer, every shell company. Isabella, you have access to the family's internal audit systems that he doesn't know you understand as well as you do. Start there. And Dante? Rocco asked. I'll handle Dante myself, Valentina said, something hard and certain settling into her voice. I grew up watching that man. I know how he thinks. If he's guilty, I'll find the crack in him before he even realizes I'm looking. Salvatore's eyes found hers across the table, dark with worry beneath the cold resolve. Be careful. If he's the one who did this, if he's capable of ordering photographs fabricated, of feeding information to the Baroness that nearly got our son killed, he is far more dangerous than the old family friend you remember. I know exactly how dangerous he might be, Valentina said quietly. That's precisely why I'm the one who has to look. Outside the tall windows, morning light had begun to burn the last of the fog off the Hudson, and somewhere across the city, in an office with the blinds drawn against the sun, 2 men, each unaware the other had ever been considered a suspect at all, moved carefully, separately, through the final stages of a plan 7 years in the making. Unaware that the family they had spent so long manipulating had finally, belatedly, begun to look directly at them. Valentina found Dante Ricci exactly where she expected to, in the small, book-lined office at the back of the Moretti Social Club on Mulberry Street, where he had conducted the family's quieter business for 2 decades. A room that smelled of old paper and the particular dust of a man who had spent his entire adult life in service of other people's ambitions. He looked up when she entered, and his face did the thing she remembered from her whole childhood, softening instantly, unguarded, the expression of a man who had genuinely, uncomplicatedly loved her since she was a small girl sitting on his knee while he taught her to play scopa. Valentina. He rose, coming around the desk to embrace her, and she let him, forcing her body to relax into the hug, despite the cold, clinical part of her mind that was cataloguing everything about him. The slight tremor in his hands as he pulled back, the way his eyes moved just for a fraction of a second toward the door before returning to her face. "I heard about Matteo. Thank God he's safe. Thank God." "Thank God," Valentina echoed, and sat, uninvited, in the leather chair across from his desk. "I need to ask you something, Zio Dante. Something that's been troubling me since I came back to New York." "Anything." 7 years ago," she said, watching his face with the particular attention she had learned from a lifetime spent reading rooms full of men who did not always say what they meant. "Someone destroyed my relationship with Salvatore Conti, with photographs and a recording that were entirely fabricated. I never learned who did it or why. But I've started asking myself lately whether it was someone close to my own family. Someone who had access to my likeness, my voice, my schedule. Someone with a reason to want the alliance broken." Dante's face did not change. That was the thing she would think about later, replaying this conversation, the sheer control of it. But his hands, folded now on the desk in front of him, went very slightly, almost imperceptibly, still. "I remember that time," he said carefully. "You disappeared not long after. Your father grieved terribly, though he tried never to show it. You argued against the truce dinner before I ever met Salvatore," Valentina said. "You told my father a Conti alliance would be a mistake. When you learned Salvatore and I had fallen in love, you asked him twice for permission to, I believe your words were, resolve the situation." Dante's expression shifted, finally, into something wounded, indignant. "Valentina, I asked your father for permission to send you somewhere safe, to Milan, to relatives, somewhere the Contis couldn't use you as leverage against him. That was concern for your safety, not... My God, is that what this is? Are you accusing me of destroying your own happiness?" "I'm asking questions," Valentina said evenly. "That's all." "After 20 years of service to this family," Dante said, his voice rising now, genuinely wounded, or performing wounded, perfectly, Valentina could not yet tell which. "After I held your father's organization together through wars that would have destroyed a lesser man, you come to me with insinuations. Based on what? An old argument about strategy? Based on the fact that someone benefited from my heartbreak," Valentina said quietly, "and I intend to find out who." Dante rose from behind the desk, and for just a moment, just a single, unguarded moment, something moved behind his eyes that made every instinct Valentina had inherited from a lifetime in this world scream a warning. Then it was gone, smoothed over by 20 years of practiced composure, and he simply looked at her with the wounded dignity of an old man falsely accused. "I loved you like my own daughter," he said. I still do. Whatever you believe I did, Valentina, I would ask you to look elsewhere before you let it poison the only family you have left. She left the club 20 minutes later, unsatisfied, uncertain, and deeply unsettled by the single flicker she had seen behind Dante's composure. Not guilt, exactly, not the tell of a man caught in a lie, but something closer to fear. The fear of a man watching a trap he had helped build begin, finally, to close around someone else entirely. She called Salvatore from the car. He's hiding something. I couldn't get him to break, but there's something underneath everything he said. Fear, mostly. But I don't think it was fear for himself. Isabella found something, Salvatore said, and his voice had gone tight, urgent. Come back to the penthouse. Now. Isabella was waiting for them in Salvatore's study when Valentina arrived. A laptop open on the desk, her face pale in the glow of the screen. 4 years ago, she said, without preamble. Shortly after Papa died, Vittorio set up 3 shell accounts in the Caymans. I found them because he made one small mistake. He used the same numbered account structure my father had taught both of us years ago. A private family method neither of us thought anyone outside our immediate circle knew. He probably assumed no one would ever look closely enough to recognize it. What's been moving through them? Salvatore asked, his voice low, dangerous. 6-figure transfers, Isabella said, quarterly, for 4 years, all originating from a holding company registered in Delaware. She turned the laptop toward them. I traced the holding company's ownership through 2 more shells before I found the name behind it. Valentina leaned forward, reading the name on the screen, and felt the room tilt slightly around her. Barone Family Trust. He's been funding them, Salvatore said, very quietly, very evenly, in the particular tone Valentina now understood to be far more dangerous than shouting. For 4 years. My own uncle has been funding the Barone family's operations for 4 years, ever since my father died and left him running this organization. There's more, Isabella said, her voice shaking now despite her obvious effort to stay composed. I cross-referenced the transfer dates against known dates in our family's history. Salvatore, the largest single transfer, nearly triple the usual quarterly amount, went out 11 days before Nonno's funeral. The room went utterly silent. That's before Valentina and Matteo arrived in New York, Salvatore said slowly. Before anyone outside your immediate family, Valentina, knew you were coming. Which means, Valentina finished, her blood running cold, Vittorio knew we were coming before I did, which means someone inside my own family told him. Isabella's eyes moved between them, wide with the particular horror of a young woman realizing her own uncle was capable of monstrous things, and something else, a dawning, terrible suspicion that made her hands on the laptop keys begin visibly to shake. Valentina, she said slowly, who else in your family knew the exact date you were arriving? Valentina's mouth went dry. Only my father, she said, and Dante, because Dante manages my father's calendar. He's the one who told me about the funeral in the first place. They laid it out fully that night, the 4 of them gathered again around Salvatore's kitchen table, with Rocco summoned back from the townhouse despite the late hour, piecing together 7 years of betrayal with the grim, methodical care of surgeons opening a wound to find the infection at its root. It was never one man, Salvatore said, staring at the financial records Isabella had spread across the marble. It was both of them, working together from the very beginning. The theory assembled itself with a horrible, elegant logic. Dante Ricci and Vittorio Conti had known each other for 30 years, not as friends exactly, but as counterparts across the same old war. Men who had negotiated territorial disputes and prisoner exchanges and uneasy ceasefires between their respective families since long before either Valentina or Salvatore had been born. Two men whose entire value to their organizations existed because the conflict between the Morettis and the Contis existed. Two men who had watched, with mounting alarm, as their families' children fell in love in a way that threatened to end the only war either of them had ever known how to profit from. 7 years ago, Valentina said slowly, working through it aloud. They must have realized Salvatore and I were serious. Serious enough that our fathers might actually consider a formal alliance, if we asked. That would have made both of them obsolete overnight. Dante's skill at managing hostility, Vittorio's control over operations that only needed centralizing because of an ongoing war. So they manufactured the lie together, Salvatore said grimly. Dante had access to your life, Valentina, your schedule, your voice on recorded calls with your father, photographs from family events. Vittorio had access to mine, knew exactly how to deliver a courier package that would reach me without any traceable origin, knew exactly what would destroy my trust instantly and completely. And when it worked, Isabella said quietly, when you ended things and Valentina disappeared to Milan, they simply kept managing their respective sides of the same conflict, exactly as they had for decades, except now with the added insurance that the two of you would never come back together to threaten their positions again. Until my grandfather died, Salvatore said, and his will forced our families back into contact, regardless of what either of them wanted. Vittorio panicked, Rocco said slowly, understanding dawning across his weathered features. Enzo's will didn't just force negotiations, it explicitly named the possibility that a lie had separated you both and demanded an investigation. That was a direct threat to everything Vittorio had spent 4 years building. He needed a way to derail the peace process entirely, fast, before anyone started looking too closely at exactly who had motive to keep the war alive. So he reached out to the Baroness, Valentina said, an organization he'd already been quietly funding for 4 years, buying loyalty against exactly this kind of emergency. He arranged Matteo's kidnapping to look like outside interference, a message from a third party, nothing that would point back toward the Conti's own inner circle. But he needed inside information to make it work, Salvatore said. He needed to know exactly when you and Matteo would be vulnerable, exactly which nanny to target, exactly which school Matteo attended. That's information only someone close to your own household would have, Valentina. Which means Dante didn't just help engineer the original lie 7 years ago. He's still actively feeding Vittorio information now. Valentina closed her eyes. 7 years of careful, protective illusions about the man who had bounced her on his knee as a child, collapsing all at once into something far uglier. My father trusted him completely. 20 years, Papa. 20 years he's been inside your house, and this whole time... We don't move yet, Rocco said. And though his voice was steady, Valentina could see the effort the calm was costing him, the particular fury of an old Don discovering a betrayal 30 years in the making inside his own most trusted circle. If we confront them now, with financial records and suspicion, but no direct confession, they will simply deny everything, and destroy whatever remaining evidence exists before we can act. We need them to believe they are still undiscovered. We need one of them to make a mistake. They already made one, Isabella said. The transfer, 11 days before the funeral. If Vittorio panics again, if he believes the peace process is truly about to succeed, he'll need to move against it a second time. And this time, we'll be watching for it. Salvatore's jaw was tight, a muscle working furiously beneath the skin, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped into something low and lethal that made Valentina's chest ache with a fierce, protective love she hadn't fully allowed herself to feel until this exact moment. He is my father's own brother. He held me when I was born. He stood beside me at my father's funeral and swore he would help me carry this family through anything. His hands had curled into fists on the table's marble surface, and he has spent 7 years destroying the one thing in my life I have ever wanted purely for myself, purely because it threatened his own convenience. Salvatore. Valentina reached across the table, covering his fist with her hand, feeling the tension coiled beneath his skin like a wire pulled taut to breaking. We will make him answer for it, all of it, but we do it carefully, and we do it together. He looked at her, and something in his eyes, grief, fury, and beneath both something steadier, something that looked almost like gratitude for not having to carry this alone, softened just slightly. Together, he agreed, low. There is a formal negotiation session scheduled in 3 days. Both families, all the senior members, gathered in the same room to finalize the Bellamy Warehouse arrangement my grandfather's will required. Vittorio will be there. Dante will be there. If we're right about what happens next, they'll try something, Rocco finished grimly. One last attempt to derail this peace before it's formally sealed. And this time, we'll be ready for them. Isabella closed the laptop slowly, her young face suddenly much older than her 24 years. What happens to them once we have proof? Once we can prove it beyond any doubt? No one answered her directly, but the silence that filled the kitchen carried its own answer, heavy and absolute, the particular silence of a family preparing to deliver a justice that would never see the inside of a courtroom, in a world where blood answered for blood and betrayal answered, always, for itself. The negotiation session was held, at Salvatore's insistence, at the Bellamy Warehouse itself, the very property named in his grandfather's will, the fault line along which 3 generations of violence had occurred, transformed for one afternoon into a room full of folding chairs, legal documents, and 2 families sitting, for the first time in living memory, on the same side of a table, rather than across from each other, with weapons within reach. Valentina sat beside her father, Matteo safely back at the penthouse under Isabella's fiercely protective supervision, and watched Vittorio Conti take his seat across the room with an outward composure so perfect it made her skin crawl now that she knew what lay beneath it. Dante Ricci sat near her father, attentive, deferential, exactly as he had appeared her entire life, and she found herself unable to look at him directly for more than a few seconds at a time without her hands curling into fists in her lap. The formal business proceeded first, the joint deed transfer, the appointment of a neutral property manager, the careful, deliberate language lawyers from both families had spent a week negotiating to ensure neither side could later claim the other had gained unfair advantage. Salvatore conducted himself throughout with the cold, controlled precision Valentina had watched him wield in every room since she'd returned to New York, giving no sign at all of the fury she knew was coiled beneath his composure, waiting. It was Vittorio himself who made the opening move, near the end of the session, when the formal paperwork had been signed and the room had begun to loosen into the cautious, testing conversation of two families, uncertain how far this new peace actually extended. "Before we conclude," Vittorio said, rising, his voice carrying the particular gravity of a man about to deliver difficult news, "I feel obligated to raise a concern that several of our organization's senior members have voiced to me privately, concerns about security, about the wisdom of formalizing this arrangement while an active threat, the Baroni family's attack on young Matteo, remains unresolved." "The Baroni family will be dealt with," Salvatore said evenly. "Will they?" Vittorio's tone remained perfectly reasonable, perfectly measured, the tone of a concerned elder statesman, rather than a man watching his own carefully constructed trap begin to close. "Or will this peace process simply provide them further opportunity to exploit the vulnerabilities created by two previously hostile families, suddenly sharing territory, resources, information? I raise this not to obstruct my nephew's clearly heartfelt wishes." His eyes flicked briefly toward Valentina, and something in them made her stomach turn, "but out of genuine concern for this family's safety." "That's an interesting concern," Salvatore said, "coming from the man who has been personally financing the Baroni family's operations for the last 4 years. The room went utterly silent. Vittorio's composure did not break immediately. That was the thing Valentina would remember most clearly afterward, the sheer discipline of it. 30 years of practiced control, holding, even as the accusation landed directly, publicly, in front of every senior member of both families. But his hands, resting on the back of his chair, went very slightly white-knuckled. "That is a serious accusation, Salvatore," Vittorio said carefully. "I would ask you to be certain before you make it in a room full of witnesses." "I am certain." Salvatore's voice had gone cold, absolutely level, and Isabella, who had insisted on attending despite the danger, seated at Salvatore's right hand, opened the laptop in front of her, turning it to face the room. 3 shell accounts, registered in the Caymans 4 years ago, using a numbered structure our father taught only the two of us, Vittorio. Quarterly transfers to a holding company that traces back, through 2 additional shells, to a Barone family trust. The largest single transfer, nearly triple the usual amount, went out 11 days before our grandfather's funeral, before Valentina or her son had even arrived in New York. The colour had drained entirely from Vittorio's face now, and around the room senior Conti men who had known him for decades were exchanging glances of dawning, horrified comprehension. "This is absurd," Vittorio said, but his voice had lost its earlier steadiness. "Fabricated records, manufactured by a woman with every reason to want this family's leadership discredited." "I haven't finished," Salvatore said. "There's more, Vittorio. There's the matter of 7 years ago. Photographs, a recording, a lie precise enough to destroy my relationship with Valentina in a single night. A lie that required intimate knowledge of both our lives, delivered by someone with access to my own household and hers." His eyes swept the room deliberately until they landed on Dante Ricci, whose face had gone the colour of old parchment. Someone who had a partner on the other side of this room. Someone who has spent 30 years managing this war, and who stood to lose everything the moment a genuine peace became possible. Dante rose from his chair so fast it clattered backward against the concrete floor. "I have served this family for 20 years. You served your own interests for 20 years, Rocco said, and the old man's voice, though weakened by illness, carried across the room with the particular authority of a don who had finally, completely understood the shape of a betrayal 3 decades in the making. I trusted you with my daughter's life, Dante. I trusted you with the calendar that told you exactly when she would return to this city, and you sold that information to a man plotting to have my grandson kidnapped. I never— Dante's composure had shattered completely now, his eyes darting toward the door, toward the armed men positioned at every exit, toward Vittorio, who stood frozen at the head of the room, with the particular stillness of an animal that had finally understood it was cornered. "You did," Salvatore said quietly. "Both of you. For 7 years. And you very nearly cost me my son's life to protect a war that was never yours to preserve." The Bellamy warehouse, silent now except for the distant hum of traffic through its high industrial windows, held its breath. 2 families, gathered in the exact place where 3 generations of blood had been spilled between them, watching 2 men who had orchestrated that entire tragedy finally, catastrophically, run out of places left to hide. It was Vittorio who moved first. Later, Valentina would understand that he had known this moment might come, that a man who spent 4 years quietly financing a rival family's operations did not do so without planning, somewhere in the back of his mind, for exactly this kind of exposure. His hand went beneath his jacket with a speed that belied his 58 years, and for one suspended, terrible second, the entire room seemed to freeze around the glint of the pistol he brought up level with Salvatore's chest. "Don't move," Vittorio said, and his voice had shed every trace of the reasonable, aggrieved elder statesman he had performed a moment before, revealing something far colder beneath. "Any of you. I built this organization's daily operations for 4 years, while you were too young and too grief-stricken to do it yourself, Salvatore. I am not going to lose everything to a woman's laptop and an old man's dying accusations." "Put the gun down, Vittorio." Salvatore had not moved, had not so much as flinched, though Valentina, standing frozen a few feet away, every muscle in her body screaming to reach him, could see the fury coiled beneath his stillness like a wire drawn to its absolute breaking point. "You're not walking out of this room, you know that. The only question left is whether you walk out of it alive." "I have men outside," Vittorio said, "loyal to me, not to you. The men outside were replaced this morning," Isabella said quietly, from where she stood at Salvatore's side, her own hands trembling, but her voice steady. "I made the calls myself, Uncle Vittorio. Every man on the perimeter today answers to Salvatore. You've been alone in this since the moment you walked through that door." Something in Vittorio's face cracked at that. Not surrender, not yet, but the particular desperation of a cornered man realizing every avenue he'd planned for had already been closed. His eyes darted toward Dante, who stood frozen near the overturned chair, sweat beading visibly along his hairline. "Dante," Vittorio said, low, urgent. "The east door, now." Dante did not move. Whatever loyalty had bound the two men together for 3 decades of quiet collusion, Valentina watched it fail entirely in that instant. Watched Dante Ricci, a man who had spent her entire childhood teaching her to play scopa, who had wept or performed weeping at the news of her son's kidnapping, simply stand, frozen, calculating, the particular cowardice of a man who had never intended to face the consequences of his own choices directly. "Dante!" Vittorio's voice cracked with something close to panic now, the gun still levelled at Salvatore's chest, but his attention fracturing, dividing between the threat in front of him and the ally abandoning him behind. It was the fracture Salvatore had been waiting for. He moved with a speed that Valentina, even having watched him her whole adult life, had never fully witnessed, closing the distance between himself and Vittorio in a single fluid motion, one hand closing around his uncle's wrist and wrenching the pistol upward and away in the same instant it discharged, the shot burying itself harmlessly in the warehouse's high steel rafters with a crack that echoed like thunder through the sudden, chaotic scramble of the room. What followed happened in seconds that felt, to Valentina, like minutes. Salvatore's men closing in from every side of the room, Vittorio struggling uselessly against a grip that had clearly been trained for exactly this kind of moment his entire life. Dante making a final, desperate lunge toward the east door before Rocco's own men, positioned with quiet foresight along that exact exit, brought him down hard against the concrete floor. And then, as suddenly as it had erupted, it was over. Vittorio Conti knelt on the warehouse floor with his own nephew's men holding him fast, the gun skittering harmlessly across the concrete. His composure, that 30-year performance of loyalty and reason, finally, completely stripped away, to reveal nothing beneath it but naked, ugly fear. Dante lay pinned a few feet away, his face pressed against the cold floor, sobbing now with the particular self-pity of a man who had never once, in 7 years of quiet betrayal, imagined he would ever be made to answer for it in front of the family he'd claimed to love. Salvatore stood over his uncle, breathing hard, his hands still shaking, not with fear, Valentina understood, watching him, but with a rage so total it had nowhere left to discharge itself now that the immediate danger had passed. "You held me the day I was born," Salvatore said, and his voice, though quiet, carried through the entire silent warehouse. "You stood beside me at my father's grave and swore an oath to protect this family with your life. And you spent 7 years destroying the only thing I have ever wanted purely for myself." "You nearly got my son killed, Vittorio, to protect a war that was never yours to preserve." "Salvatore," Vittorio's voice cracked, some final desperate bid for the nephew he had once genuinely loved. "I did it for this family. Everything I did to protect what your father built. You did it for yourself," Salvatore said, and his voice finally broke, not into weakness, but into something rawer, more honest than Valentina had heard from him even in their most private moments. "You did it because a real peace would have made you obsolete, and you could not bear the thought of your own irrelevance more than you could bear the thought of my happiness. That is not loyalty, Vittorio. That was never loyalty. That was 7 years of quiet murder dressed up as family duty. Across the room, Valentina caught Rocco's eye over Dante's prone, sobbing form, and saw in her father's weathered face the same terrible, necessary resolve she felt settling into her own chest. The understanding, absolute and unavoidable, that whatever came next for these two men would not be decided by any court in any country, but by the particular, ancient justice of the world both families had been born into, a justice that had waited 7 long years for exactly this moment to finally, completely, be served. What happened to Vittorio Conti and Dante Ricci in the days that followed was never spoken of directly, in either family, ever again. Valentina understood, in the careful, deliberate silence that settled over both households afterward, that some things in this world were handled in rooms she would never be invited into, by men whose entire purpose was to ensure that certain forms of betrayal answered only to a justice no courtroom would ever be permitted to witness. She did not ask Salvatore for details. He did not offer them. There was, she came to understand, a particular mercy in not knowing, a mercy that allowed her to hold her son a little longer that night, without the specific weight of exactly how the men who had threatened his life had finally been made to answer for it. What she did know was this. Within a week, Vittorio Conti's name had been quietly, entirely removed from every document, every account, every position of authority he had held within the Conti organization, and no one, in any room she entered afterward, ever spoke his name aloud again. Dante Ricci's chair at her father's social club sat empty from that day forward, and when she asked Rocco, once, gently, what had become of him, her father had simply looked at her with old, tired eyes and said, "He will not trouble this family again, cara. That is all you need to carry." The Barone family's operations in New York collapsed within a month, starved of the funding that had sustained their expansion for 4 years, their remaining soldiers absorbed or scattered by rival organizations eager to claim territory the Baroness could no longer defend. It was not, Salvatore told her quietly one evening, a war. It was simply the natural collapse of an organization that had been propped up entirely by another man's betrayal, and once that betrayal had been excised, there had been nothing left to hold it upright. "Do you feel it?" Salvatore asked her, 1 week after the warehouse, standing beside her on the terrace of his penthouse as the last light drained slowly out of the sky over the Hudson. The absence of it. 7 years of a war I never fully understood the shape of, and now, nothing. Just quiet. "I feel it," Valentina said. "It doesn't feel like victory exactly. It feels more like—" She searched for the word, watching the water darken below them. "Like finally being allowed to put down something heavy I didn't even realize I'd been carrying every single day." Salvatore's hand found hers on the terrace railing, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the cooling evening air, watching the city's lights begin to bloom against the darkening sky. Two people who had spent 7 years believing themselves permanently, irrevocably separated by a lie neither of them had asked to be told. "My grandfather knew," Salvatore said finally, "or suspected at least. That's what his will was really asking of us, not just a peace treaty, an investigation. He knew, somewhere in his last years, that something had gone wrong between us that neither of us had chosen, and he spent whatever time he had left trying to engineer a way to give us the chance to find out the truth, even after he was gone. He gave us more than that, Valentina said quietly. He gave Matteo a chance to know his father. He gave our families a chance to stop bleeding each other for reasons neither of us fully understood anymore. He gave me you, Salvatore said, turning to face her fully now, his eyes dark and steady in the last of the evening light. Twice, Valentina. He gave me you twice. And I nearly threw it away the first time, out of a wound so old I never even questioned it. I am not going to make that mistake again. Inside, through the tall glass doors, Valentina could hear Matteo's laughter. Isabella had come to babysit for the evening, and by the sound of it, the two of them were deep into some elaborate game involving every stuffed animal the penthouse's newly stocked nursery now contained. And something in her chest ached with a gratitude so profound it nearly brought her to tears. Standing there on that terrace, with the man she had spent 7 years believing she would never be permitted to love again. "There's something I need to tell you," Salvatore said, and something in his voice had shifted, gone careful, almost nervous in a way she had never once heard from him in all the years she had known him. "Something I should have told you 7 years ago, before any of this happened, before the lie, before Milan, before any of it. Salvatore, I had a ring made," he said, "before everything fell apart. Not the Conti signet my mother expected me to give a bride. Something simpler. An emerald. The exact shade of the dress you wore the night we met." His jaw worked, and for the first time since she had known him, Valentina watched Salvatore Conti struggle visibly, openly, to find his words. "I never gave it to you. 3 weeks before I planned to, someone destroyed everything between us. And I told myself, afterward, that I'd been a fool to ever want something so completely that its loss could nearly break me. Salvatore, what are you—" "I still have it," he said. "I kept it. 7 years, 3 continents I've travelled for business, 1 grandfather's funeral, and I have carried that ring with me the entire time, telling myself it was simply something I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I understand now that I kept it because some part of me never stopped believing, however foolishly, that I would find a way to give it to you, eventually." Valentina's breath caught, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that made speech, for a long moment, entirely impossible. "I'm not asking tonight," Salvatore said quickly, reading something in her expression, his own composure cracking into something almost boyish, almost afraid. "There's too much still unresolved between us. 7 years of grief I need to properly grieve with you, not around you. A son I need to learn how to father the way he deserves, not the way circumstance has forced me into it these last few weeks. I'm not asking tonight, Valentina. I just needed you to know it exists, that it always has, that whatever you decide, whenever you decide it, I will be here, holding that ring, for as long as it takes." Valentina reached up, cupping his face in both hands, feeling the rough stubble beneath her palms, the particular warmth of a man who had spent 7 years convincing himself he no longer deserved the thing he wanted most. "Then don't wait 7 more years to show it to me," she whispered. "I think we've both waited long enough." He did not propose that night. He waited 3 more weeks, long enough, he told her later, to be certain that whatever he offered her was built on something steadier than the adrenaline of survival, something that could hold weight for the rest of both their lives, rather than simply the relief of having lived through a war neither of them had chosen. In that time, the two of them built something neither had quite dared to name yet. Not simply lovers reunited, not simply co-parents learning the awkward, tender choreography of raising a child together after 6 years apart, but something closer to a genuine partnership, forged in the particular fire of everything they had both survived. Salvatore learned Matteo's favourite bedtime stories, learned the specific way the boy liked his eggs, learned to sit through an hour of plastic soldier warfare with the same patient absorption he brought to every negotiation of his adult life. Valentina learned, in turn, the man Salvatore had become in her absence, harder in some ways, gentler in others. A man who had built an empire out of grief and had never once, until now, allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to build something out of joy instead. Their families, too, began, slowly, cautiously, with the particular wariness of two old enemies, uncertain how to hold peace without flinching, to knit themselves together into something new. Rocco Moretti and the surviving Conti elders sat at joint dinners now, awkward at first, thick with the residue of 30 years of hostility, but softening week by week into something that occasionally, astonishingly, resembled actual warmth. Isabella had taken to Matteo with the fierce, delighted devotion of a young aunt discovering for the first time exactly how much love she had to give. And Matteo, resilient in the particular way of children who are loved thoroughly and told the truth gently, had begun to speak of Zia Isabella and Nonno Rocco and Papa, with the easy, unself-conscious confidence of a boy who had never once doubted, in the end, that he belonged completely to all of them. It was on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the confrontation at the Bellamy warehouse, that Salvatore finally brought Valentina to the terrace of the penthouse one more time. Matteo already asleep, Isabella having quietly excused herself hours before. With a knowing smile, Valentina had chosen not to examine too closely, and knelt, without any of the elaborate staging she half expected from a man capable of commanding armies, simply lowering himself to one knee on the cool stone, with the small velvet box he had carried for 7 years finally open in his palm. The emerald caught the city lights exactly as he had described it, the precise, impossible shade of the green dress she had worn the night they met, set simply, without ostentation, as though the ring itself had been waiting patiently for 7 years to finally, quietly, come home. I have loved you since the moment you told me I was staring rudely at a truce dinner neither of our fathers ever intended to honour, Salvatore said, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it, stripped entirely of the cold control he wore like armour in every other room of his life. I loved you through 8 months. I still consider the truest happiness I have ever known. I loved you, even when I was lying to myself that I hated you. For 7 years, I will never be able to give back to either of us. And I have loved you every single day since I saw you standing across my grandfather's casket and understood, in an instant, that I had never actually stopped. Valentina's hands had risen to her mouth, tears already spilling freely down her cheeks. 7 years of grief and hope tangling together into something too large for her chest to contain. I am not a gentle man, Valentina, Salvatore continued, his own eyes bright now, unashamed. I am not an easy one to love. I come from a world built on violence and suspicion, and old wounds that never fully close. And I will spend the rest of my life making mistakes born from that world, the way I made the worst mistake of my life 7 years ago, by believing a lie instead of trusting you. But I will never again let anyone, not a traitor, not an old grudge, not my own wounded pride, convince me that you are anything other than the truest, bravest, most extraordinary person I have ever known. I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you, every single day, if you'll let me. Salvatore, marry me, he said, and it was not a question so much as a vow, the particular kind of certainty she remembered from every negotiation she had watched him win, except now aimed entirely, helplessly, at her. Marry me, and let me be Matteo's father in full, not just in blood, but in every single day we have left. Marry me, and let me spend the rest of my life making up for the 7 years I cannot give either of you back. Valentina sank down onto the stone beside him, unable to wait even the few seconds it would have taken him to slide the ring onto her finger, and kissed him with everything she had held back through 7 years of careful, protective distance, grief and rage and hope, and a love so total it had survived a lie designed specifically to destroy it. Survived an ocean, survived 7 years of silence, survived a kidnapping and a confrontation, and the slow, patient unmasking of 2 men who had spent decades trying to keep them apart. "Yes," she said, against his mouth, laughing and crying in the same breath. "Yes, Salvatore, 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled. Salvatore Conti, cold and controlled and feared by men twice his age, trembling like a boy of 26, discovering for the first time that some things in this world were worth being afraid of wanting. And when it settled home, catching the city lights in exactly the shade of green she had worn the night they met, Valentina understood, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that whatever war had once stood between their families, whatever lies had once tried to keep them apart, none of it had ever stood a chance against the particular stubborn persistence of a love that had simply refused, across 7 years and an ocean and a mountain of manufactured grief, to actually die. Inside, through the tall glass doors, a small voice called out sleepily into the dark. "Mama? Papa?" And both of them rose together, hand in hand, to go answer it. A family, finally, completely whole. The wedding was held 6 months later, in October, on the grounds of the Oyster Bay estate, where Enzo Conti's funeral had first brought Valentina back into Salvatore's orbit. A choice that had felt, to both of them, less like irony than like closing a circle that had been left painfully open for 7 years. Rocco Moretti walked his daughter down an aisle, laid between 2 families who had spent 3 decades trying to destroy each other. And if his hands trembled more than they once had, if he leaned more heavily than he wanted to on the cane he refused to be parted from, even for photographs, his eyes, when he looked at Valentina, were as fierce and proud as they had ever been in her entire life. "Your mother would have loved this day," he murmured to her, just before he handed her hand to Salvatore, beneath an arch of white roses and Italian cypress. She always believed love was the one force in this world stronger than any war. I spent 30 years telling myself she was naive. His voice cracked, just slightly. I am glad, Cara, to have lived long enough to learn she was right. Matteo stood at the front of the small crowd in a miniature suit that matched his father's exactly, holding a small velvet pillow with the rings balanced with the intense, careful gravity of a 7-year-old who understood, in his own way, that he was witnessing something important. The formal, public joining of the two halves of his own existence that had spent his entire life, until 6 months ago, kept carefully, painfully apart. Isabella stood as maid of honour, radiant and unabashedly weeping through the entire ceremony, and beside her stood a scattering of Conti cousins and Moretti relations who, 6 months earlier, would not have shared a room without armed men stationed at every exit, now laughing together over champagne, exchanging the particular relieved, cautious warmth of two old enemies, discovering that peace, once actually attempted, was considerably less difficult to maintain than either family had spent 30 years assuming. The ceremony itself was simple, at Valentina's request. No grand cathedral, no elaborate spectacle. Simply a small chapel on the estate grounds where Salvatore's grandparents had married 60 years before, filled with white roses and the particular golden light of an October afternoon giving way slowly to evening. I, Salvatore, take you, Valentina, he said, his voice steady now, in a way it had not been on the terrace 6 months earlier, to be my wife. I have already promised you every version of my devotion I know how to give, my protection, my loyalty, the whole of whatever future I have left to offer. Today I promise you something I did not fully understand how to offer 7 years ago. My trust, complete and unquestioning, for as long as we both live. I will never again let a lie stand between us. I will never again choose my own wounded pride over the truth of who you are. Valentina, her voice breaking with the particular joy that had taken her 7 years and an entire war to earn, answered in kind. I, Valentina, take you, Salvatore, to be my husband. I loved you once with the reckless faith of a girl who had never yet been taught that love could be weaponized against her, and that love nearly destroyed us both. Today I love you with something steadier, a woman's faith, tested by fire, chosen deliberately, every single day, rather than simply felt. I promise you my whole heart, my whole trust, and every remaining day of the life we build together, starting with the son who has already taught us both more about love than either of us knew before he existed. When the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, the small chapel erupted into an applause that Valentina would remember for the rest of her life as the precise sound of a war, finally, completely ending. Not with a treaty, not with a will's careful legal provisions, but with something far simpler and far more permanent. Two families choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to build something new out of the wreckage of everything that had once divided them. The reception stretched long into the October evening, the estate's gardens lit with strings of warm gold lights, a small orchestra playing beneath the same oak tree where, 7 years and 1 lifetime ago, Salvatore Conti had first told a girl in a green dress that he was worried about her. Valentina danced with her father, slow and careful, both of them crying openly and neither particularly caring who saw. She danced with Matteo, lifting him onto her feet the way she had when he was small enough to fit entirely against her hip, and watched Salvatore cut in halfway through to lift his son properly into his arms instead, spinning him until the boy shrieked with laughter loud enough to carry across the whole garden. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had begun to drift toward the terrace for coffee and grappa, Isabella found Valentina near the edge of the dance floor, both of them slightly breathless, slightly overwhelmed by the sheer improbable weight of everything the day had held. "I keep thinking about Nonno's will," Isabella said quietly, watching Salvatore across the garden, laughing at something Rocco had said, Matteo perched on his shoulders despite the late hour and his mother's half-hearted protests. "He asked for a peace, and perhaps, if he was permitted one final indulgence as a dying old fool, love. I don't think even he imagined he'd get both, quite this completely. I don't think any of us did," Valentina said softly. "Least of all, me." "Do you ever think about them?" Isabella asked, her voice dropping. Vittorio, Dante. What might have happened if Salvatore's grandfather hadn't written that will exactly the way he did? If we'd never had reason to look closely enough to find what they'd done? Valentina considered the question for a long moment, watching her husband. Her husband, a word she suspected she would spend months simply marvelling at the shape of in her own mouth, spin their son slowly beneath the string lights, both of them laughing, entirely unburdened for this one perfect evening by any of the darkness that had nearly cost them everything. "I think," Valentina said finally, "that some lies are simply too heavy to carry forever." I think the truth was always going to find its way to the surface eventually, whether Enzo Conti's will forced it or not, because some loves are simply too stubborn to stay buried, no matter how carefully someone else tries to bury them. She turned to look at Isabella, her own eyes bright with the particular clarity of a woman who had survived the very worst her world had to offer, and found, on the other side of it, something worth every single scar. "I think Salvatore and I were always going to find our way back to each other, Isabella. Every lie in the world was never going to be enough to stop that. It just took the truth a little longer than it should have." Above them, the October stars had begun to emerge in full over the Long Island Sound, and somewhere beneath that same sky, in the small stone chapel where they had spoken their vows only hours before, the last of the white roses continued to release their sweetness into the cooling autumn air, entirely indifferent to the 3 decades of blood and grief it had taken 2 families to finally, completely, arrive at peace. 1 year later. The nursery at the Tribeca penthouse had grown over the past year from a single guest room hastily converted the night of Matteo's rescue into a proper wing of its own. 2 bedrooms now, connected by a shared playroom, because Matteo had a sister now, 4 months old and sleeping soundly in the crib beside their bed, named Elena after the grandmother she would never meet, but whose gentle, patient spirit Valentina liked to believe she could already see in the baby's calm, watchful eyes. Valentina stood at the same tall window where, 1 year ago, almost to the day, she had watched black town cars arrive for a funeral that had unmade and then remade the entire shape of her life, and found herself, this time, watching something considerably more ordinary. Salvatore in the garden 4 stories below, teaching Matteo, 7 years old now, and taller by a full head than the frightened, brave boy who had whispered to himself in a Barone warehouse a year earlier how to properly throw a baseball, both of them laughing at some private joke that carried up faintly on the autumn air. "He's better at this than you were," came a voice from behind her, and Valentina turned to find her father settling carefully into the armchair by the window, considerably frailer now than he had been even at the wedding, but his eyes as sharp and warm as ever, watching his great-grandson with an open, unguarded pride that had softened every hard line his long life had carved into his face. "You'd know," Valentina said. "You're the one who taught me to shoot instead of throw." "A more useful skill in our world," Rocco said, though there was no edge in it, only the particular gentle irony of an old don who had, in his final years, been given the extraordinary gift of watching his family choose an entirely different world for its youngest generation. "Though I confess, cara, I am glad my great-grandson will grow up needing baseball more than he needs a steady aim." Isabella arrived a few minutes later, breathless from the elevator, carrying an enormous, entirely impractical stuffed elephant she insisted was an essential addition to baby Elena's collection. And behind her came the rest of the family, in the particular unhurried procession of a Sunday afternoon that had become, over the past year, sacred to all of them. Conti cousins and Moretti relations arriving together now without a second thought, without the ghost of 30 years of hostility trailing behind them. Simply a family, expanded and complicated, and entirely hard-won happy. Salvatore found her on the terrace an hour later, after the garden game had wound down, and Matteo had been persuaded, with some difficulty, to come inside for lunch, his shirt damp with the particular sweat of a boy who had spent an entire afternoon exactly as a boy should. He came up behind her at the railing, sliding his arms around her waist, resting his chin against her shoulder as they both looked down at the garden below, empty now, littered with the baseball glove Matteo had abandoned mid-conversation the moment Isabella produced the elephant. "A year," Salvatore said quietly. "I keep thinking about it. A year ago today, I was standing in a room full of mourners, watching you walk toward me across my grandfather's funeral, certain I was seeing a ghost." "I was certain of the same thing," Valentina said, leaning back into him, feeling the solid, familiar warmth of his chest against her back, the particular safety of a man who had rebuilt his entire life around the promise of never again letting a lie stand between them. "I rehearsed being cold to you the whole flight from Milan. I told myself I would be composed, distant." "You were terrible at it," Salvatore said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "I was," she agreed, laughing softly. "I think some part of me knew, the moment I saw you, that being cold to you was never actually possible. I think some part of me had been waiting 7 years for exactly that moment, whether I wanted to admit it to myself or not." Below them, through the tall glass doors, they could hear the particular chaos of a family Sunday in full swing. Matteo's laughter mixing with Isabella's, Rocco's low, amused voice offering some piece of gently exaggerated wisdom, the soft, contented sounds of baby Elena beginning to stir from her nap in the next room. It was, Valentina thought, exactly the kind of ordinary, unremarkable happiness that 7 years ago she would not have believed either of their families capable of building. Not from love alone, not from reconciliation alone, but from the particular, hard-won combination of both, forged in fire and betrayal, and finally, patiently, allowed to heal. Enzo's will, Salvatore murmured against her hair, asked for peace. And perhaps, if he was permitted one final indulgence, love. I remember. I used to think he was asking for something impossible, Salvatore said. Two things this family had failed to achieve separately for 3 generations. I never imagined he was actually asking for something simpler than that. What's that? Just this, Salvatore said, turning her gently in his arms until she faced him, the autumn light catching the emerald on her hand exactly the way it had the night he proposed, exactly the shade of a green dress worn at a truce dinner neither of their fathers had ever intended to honour. 8 years and one impossible, hard-won reunion ago. A Sunday afternoon, a garden full of children who don't know what a blood feud even is, a family, however complicated, that chose to stay. Valentina reached up, cupping his face in both hands, the way she had on the terrace a year before, feeling the same rough warmth beneath her palms, the same steady, unhurried heartbeat she had once believed she would never be allowed to hold again. "Then I think we finally gave him exactly what he asked for," she said softly, and kissed her husband beneath the same autumn sky that had once watched 2 frightened, furious young lovers walk away from each other, believing it was forever, and watched them, instead, find their way, patiently, stubbornly, inevitably, all the way home.